Well, hello there, my friends, and welcome back to our 7th week of History of the Restoration Movement online. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing a fairly controversial topic, the topic of slavery in America. And I call it controversial because even though the issue of slavery is now more than 150 years old, it still bears very deep wounds in the American cultural psyche. That the issue of slavery has caused many disparities in race, many disparities within denominations themselves. And so, for example, if you were to look and you see like a church like the United Methodist Church, for example, the word United Methodist is basically a testimony that says that the Methodist Church split over the subject of slavery and only afterward reunited and had some modicum of Christian fellowship with the North-South versions of the denomination. Some of those splits never officially healed. For example, the American Baptist and the Southern Baptist split happened over the question of slavery, and those produced two denominations that have never rejoined, even to this day. Now, in the Restoration Movement, the issue of slavery is going to be important because while the movement itself will not split during the Civil War or specifically over the question of slavery, there will be tensions that will raise, and those tensions will begin to build and mount as the war becomes closer and inevitable. And so, I want to begin by looking at this as a long duration issue, just basically asking what is the biblical data on the question of slavery, and then from there we will jump to how did people within the Restoration Movement handle this biblical data and come to a theological conclusion. So, I guess without any further ado, let's hit the trail running and see what we can find on this topic. So, let me begin this topic by just showing how the problem of slavery is a problem that stretches all the way back into antiquity. This is a quote that comes from a Roman orator by the name of Gaius. And in his book known as The Institutions, he will write this. He says, quote, "Slavery is a human invention, and it's not found in nature. Indeed, it was that other human invention, war, which provided the bulk of slaves, but they were also the bounty of piracy or the product of breeding," unquote. And so I'd like to just point out to that first part of this statement that he says that slavery is a human invention. And this, of course, brings up a very interesting question. When was the first time that a human being decided to treat another human being as property? And specifically, I like the way that Gaius points out that it's not found in nature. That he says, if you look to insects, if you look to animals like, deer or bears or coyotes, we don't see them enslaving one another. They may create a social hierarchy of who's the alpha and who are the submissives, but that they don't treat one another as property. In fact, this entire discussion comes up because human beings have a very unique understanding of property, that an object can be owned, and if a person is objectified, they too can be owned. And I also like this quote because it points to the interrelationship with this idea of slavery and warfare, that the primary way that a human being has become a slave throughout history is because of a human invention as well, known as war. And that because of warfare, people are defeated in battle, they are subjugated, and with their will broken, they are frequently sold into bondage among the victors. And so Gaius, I think, is pointing out something very necessary when we start with this idea of slavery, is that it is very much a human design. And secondly, that it is a byproduct of human violence. And that while it may be perpetuated by breeding, and so that a person who was a slave will then have a child who is a slave, that the root cause of this is frequently human warfare. Now, to continue pointing out just how old the idea of slavery is, some of the oldest documents we have are specifically statements about slavery. For example, this is in what is known as the Law of Dachua. It's a document that dates to about the 18th century BC, or about 400 years before Moses. And this law writes this. It says, quote, "A slave or a slave woman who belongs to a resident of the city of Enshuna, who bears the fetters, shackles, or a slave hairlock, will not exit through the main gate with or without their owner. Additionally, a slave or slave woman who has entered the main city gate of Eshuna in the safekeeping of a foreign envoy shall bear shackles and therefore be kept safe for his owner." And so the first thing I would like to point out about slavery is that it frequently requires this idea of bondage, that in order to make a person a slave, they have to have their will taken away. And specifically that you have to restrict their ability of movement. And so it should be no surprise that some of these earliest laws about slaves are specifically statements of where they can go, how they can move, and who they have to move with. And in all of these cases, there are social repercussions, that the person who has been made a slave will have to either wear their hair a certain way, they will have to have a visible shackle on their feet or their arms, and in general, that they will have to somehow communicate to other people, I am a slave, and I am specifically owned by this person. And so we will start to see all kinds of inventions throughout the course of human history on how do you designate someone as a slave. Sometimes there will be tattooing, sometimes there will be piercing, sometimes there will just be specific clothing that indicates a slavery class of people. But in all of these cases, just point out that to make a person a slave requires stripping away their human dignity and stripping away their basic right to go where they want and serve and do what they will. Now, when it comes to discussions of the religion of the Bible and the problem of slavery, many commentators are very quick to point out, well, what about the Bible? Doesn't the Bible permit and even regulate slavery? And of course, this brings up a very interesting question. If the Bible regulates or permits something, does that mean that God is in favor of it? Does that mean that God actually wants slavery to be a real thing that people will do to one another? And I think one of the ways to address this issue is simply by doing a comparative study between some of the Israelite laws concerning slavery and some of the other ancient Near Eastern laws of slavery. And I think that this will set the tone for how to tell the difference between what God is wanting versus what human beings are doing. And so let's look at for example, the famous Code of Hammurabi. This dates to about 1750 BC. And it reads like this, quote, "If a noble breaks the bone of another noble, they shall break his bone. Now, if a noble blinds the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 60 shekels of silver. If the noble blinds the eye of a slave, he shall only pay half the value of the slave's purchase price." Unquote. And so one of the first things I'd like to note about the Code of Hammurabi is that it is made to make distinctions of class, that in Hammurabi's code there are three types of people. There are the nobles, whom the king basically needs to keep in his good graces in order to rule efficiently. There are the commoners who do a lot of the work, but at the end of the day, the king does not have to please. And there are the slaves who, like the commoners, the king has to pretty much control and regulate, but he does not have to keep them pleased. And so notice in this code that if you're a noble, there's really only one way that you get true eye for an eye, bone for bone justice. And that is, if a noble is fighting or skirmishing with another noble and there is a broken bone, that we have a one-for-one justice. But in the case of a commoner, well, the noble just pays money. And notice the diminishing returns. By the time you get to the slave class, we don't have a set amount. We just simply say, well, whatever the slave's price was, half that. And so, even though this slave has been irreconcilably injured, he has lost eyesight in an eye, we basically say he's really only lost half his value. And so, notice here that the Code of Hammurabi is unfair. At its very core, it basically says that if a noble does something wrong, his status can protect him from some of the worst consequences. Now, with all that into consideration, let's take what do we find in the books of Moses? For example, in Exodus 21:20, we read this, quote, "If a man strikes his male servant or his female servant with a staff so that he or she dies as a result from the blow, he will surely be avenged." And to follow that up, 6 verses later, we read this. "If a man strikes the eye of his male servant or his female servant so that he destroys it, he will let that servant go free as compensation for the eye." Now, compare those two statements here real quick. The first one basically says, if a man basically kills his male or female slave, he will be avenged. Now, there's a couple of ways to interpret that word avenge. The way that I personally prefer, I think that this is actually saying if a man kills a servant, whether they're male or female slave, he has committed murder, and murder laws suddenly apply. Now, there are some people who will argue otherwise, but I think a very strong case can be made that basically Exodus says there is no class distinction. If you are a slaveholder and you abuse your servant to death, you will be liable to be tried for murder. Now, the second part, I think, also talks about the dignity of the human being here, that we are specifically talking about a male or female servant, and in this case, they've lost an eye. And the person who did the striking, if they are the slave owner, has to basically say, my slavery of this person becomes null and void the moment I injure them to this point. That basically I have taken my payment for their services out in the injury they have received, and they have to go free. Now, notice the difference there between that and Hammurabi. In Hammurabi, we basically just said, you're just now a half-price servant. We have basically said, okay, well, whatever your cost is, I'll reimburse you for your loss. Here, we have specifically saying, if you've actually injured another human being, regardless of their social standing, you are liable for murder. And so this is one of the places where I think we need to start when we talk about biblical slavery, and that is that compared to other laws in the ancient Near East, biblical slavery was made to be fair. And by fair, I'm simply stating that if a person becomes a slave, they still have the dignity of their humanness. And if a person injures you, if a person tries to kill you, you have the same rights and protections under the law as if you're a free person. Now, I know what you might be saying. Okay, well, so it's more humane than the other stuff that's going on in the ancient Near East. But does that necessarily mean it's a good thing? Well, I don't think it's a good thing at all. But I think there are also some other things to take into consideration that basically help to build an anti-slavery argument from the Bible. And the first is this, that in Hebrew culture, a person can only be a slave for 7 years. When we get to what's known as the Year of Jubilee, all slavery was to come to an end. Now, if the slave wanted to stay with his master, an arrangement could be made to prolong it. But notice that that stays with the slave's prerogative. It's the slave who decides to stay longer than the 7 years, not the master. Now, second, notice biblically that runaway slaves are explicitly said to not be returned to their masters. that there are biblical laws that says if a slave tried to run away, there must have been something horribly gone wrong. Again, we are assuming basically the burden of proof that the slave was treated well rests on the master, not on the slave. And if the slave says, yeah, I ran away, we take the slave's word for it. Next, as we have already looked at, abusive masters are subject to the same laws, and if they kill or harm a slave, it's basically the same as if they killed or harmed another citizen. Simply put, all human beings have dignity under the Israelite law. And there's also another interesting thing. At the end of most slavery laws in the books of Moses, that there's the statement that says that these laws are predicated on a very simple truth. You too, Israel, were once slaves in Egypt. Basically saying, and why are we treating slaves differently? Why are we treating slaves as though they're human beings with dignity? Because we are remembering at one time, every man, woman, child, Israelite was a slave. And God freed us from that predicament. And because of that, all of a sudden, we now have not just an awareness that slavery is a wickedness, but if we're going to practice it, it must be strongly regulated to preserve and protect the dignity of the human being. So let's jump ahead now and talk about what we would often refer to as the transatlantic slave trade. This is specifically the trade of sub-Saharan Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to either North or South America. And we should probably begin by pointing out that basically with the beginning of explorations of the Spanish and the Portuguese, both to what we would call the New World and to find shorter routes to the Far East, that they came into direct contact with sub-Saharan Africa. Once they came into contact with these areas, there is a basic issue that, the Europeans have all kinds of technological advancements. They have guns, they have cannons, they have all sorts of advantages that the natives, often operating under Bronze or early Iron Age technology, simply can't compete with. And so what will frequently happen is as these countries become discovered and as trading ports and other European interests become established all along the western coast of Africa, that we're going to start to see basically a trade of European goods for African commodities. Now, the most precious of these commodities, of course, will be gold, silver, and precious metals, but there will suddenly become a need for physical labor as the areas of the New World, particularly in places like Brazil, the islands of the Indies, and eventually, when the British get into this, we're going to start to see settlements in North America as well. And so in all of these cases, we're going to have basically large amounts of land that can be used for agricultural products that we've looked at for the most part. Things like sugar, things like tobacco, things like cotton, things like corn. All of these things are going to be grown in these New World areas by Europeans. But because there's basically tons of land to be had, there's a lot of room to grow, there's going to be a need for cheap physical labor. And so very, very early on, as early as the 1500s, we're going to start to see the export of people from Africa into North and South America, specifically to be working as physical labor. Now, as I had pointed out, the bulk of these slaves are coming from Western coastal Africa, and in the beginning, countries like Portugal and Spain are going to kind of open the door for this. So if we want someone to blame for starting the process, that's really where we have to begin. And so really as early as, 1450, 1500, we start to see the trickle of human beings exported across the ocean. Now, the real change is going to be after 1600, when the British are going to rise as kind of the supreme naval power in the Atlantic. When they rise to that position, they're going to find that they can control the shipping lanes, they can control the movement of goods and products across the Atlantic, and that will include the movement of human beings. And eventually, it will be the British who will start to become the biggest exporter of African Americans. Now, it's difficult to get exact numbers on this, but some of the prime estimates are that about 20 million slaves were transported across the Atlantic Ocean between 1450 and 1830, when the process was largely curtailed. And it is further estimated that only about 12 million actually arrived alive, that the conditions of transatlantic slave trade was so bad and just, so prone to disease and other kinds of sicknesses that come on cramped ships that, we've lost 8 million people just simply in a 2-month voyage. And so what will become very apparent to many who are involved in the slave trade is that you have to, A, dehumanize a person. You have to basically treat them as though they are non-human in order to do such a thing to them. And secondly, we're going to start to see many, many people developing a conscience over this, that there's just no good way to transport a human being and, manage to get to sleep at night, having done this over and over again to enslave thousands, if not millions of people. And so we should probably go ahead and ask the question, how did you get 20 million people enslaved? Well, the simple answer is you basically allow the Africans to enslave themselves. And this is going to form what we call a triangular trade route. And it basically goes like this. Europe would begin supplying processed goods to Africans. Specifically, some of these goods would be things like alcohol or food, but more frequently they would be guns and other munitions that would be given to certain African chiefs. And, this is where the quote that we looked at the beginning of this lecture from Gaius comes in. That Gaius basically finds a distinct correlation between the institution of slavery and the institution of war. And basically the Europeans will pick up on this, that the Africans have skirmishes with one another. And if they could basically tilt the balance of power, that one chieftain, who is kind of already pro-Europeans anyway, is given weapons, given access to things like guns and cannons, all of a sudden that person can go out and defeat other smaller tribes, and the process is that this chieftain will enslave these other people and then be more than happy to sell those enslaved people to the Europeans who gave them the guns. Now, from there, these slaves are transported to the New World, and they will be used to grow agricultural products and mine other minerals and resources. And so basically, once we have this enslaved labor force taken over to the New World, they will be put to work in making the raw materials necessary to go back to Europe and create new products, which again, once we have these new products, new foodstuff, new goods, and presumably new guns and new munitions, we send those right back to Africa, and the process happens over and over and over again. And notice that what basically has to begin this process is simply the assertion that Europeans said, well, if they're going to fight, we might as well get something out of it in the process. Now, by the late 1700s and early 1800s, we're going to see many movements within Europe, particularly in places like Great Britain and France, where we're going to have groups of people known as philosophes. And the philosophes are going to basically declare that human beings should have things like rights, that they should have essential dignity simply on the grounds that they are human beings. And eventually, this idea will begin to be applied to enslaved peoples as well. And once this idea is properly applied across the board to all human beings, we suddenly have the issue of conscience. As we said, to make someone a slave is to dehumanize them. But what do you do when the society at large basically says, no, they're human beings, you can't dehumanize them? Well, all of a sudden, then you have an issue of conscience, because you all of a sudden are not doing this to an animal or to a item or an object. You're doing this to a human being. And so, as this grows, more and more people are going to basically say, this is an institution that needs to change. Now, the hero of this movement in Great Britain is going to be a man by the name of William Wilberforce. And he is going to take a lot of these ideas that are coming from France, who basically they will stop the slave trade in France by the early 1800s. But again, Great Britain is the naval power of the time. It is Great Britain that controls the flow of slaves back and forth across the Atlantic. And so it's really going to take Britain being on board with this to abolish slavery. And so William Wilberforce is probably the premier person we need to be talking about when it comes to ending the slave trade. And here's one of my favorite quotes from Wilberforce. It's a rather long one, but it goes like this, quote, "The slave trade, in its very nature, is the source of such kinds of tragedies, nor has there been a single person, almost, before the Privy Council, who does not add something by his testimony to the mass of evidence upon this point. In some, indeed, of these gentlemen, and particularly of the delegates from Liverpool, have endeavored to reason down this plain principle, and somehow palpitated it. But there is not one, I believe, who does not more or less admit it. Some, nay most, I believe, have admitted the slave trade to be the chief causes of war in Africa." So again, Wilberforce is basically beginning his address to the people of the Parliament that basically, even people who are pro-slave trade are going to tell you, yeah, we are the number one cause of war in Africa. Now, to this, Wilberforce will continue. He'll say this, quote, "I will call the attention of the House to the one of the species of evidence which is absolutely infallible, death. At least it is a sure ground of evidence, and the proportion of deaths will only confirm, but if possible, will even aggravate our suspicion of their misery in transit. It will be found, upon an average of all ships, of which evidence has been given at the Privy Council, that exclusive of those who perish before they sail, not less than 12.5% perish in the passage. Besides these, the Jamaican reports tell of not less than 4.5% die on the shore before the day of sail, which is only a week or two from the time of landing," unquote. So Wilberforce is basically saying, why does this need to end? He basically says, death. Well, why would you care about death except that we're dealing with a human being? So notice that Wilberforce is assuming, and I think rightly so, that we are dealing with human deaths here. And because of that, he basically says, look, numbers will tell this story. 12.5% die on the ship. Pick a ship, any ship. We're losing 12.5% of its human cargo. And then you get to places like Jamaica, we lose another 4.5% before we even get these people to someone who can feed them and nourish them. And so Wilberforce is making, I think, a very strong and bold statement that says, you can't claim to care about people and continue this sort of charade where human beings die. And, and they die for what? And so with this, here's how Wilberforce concludes. He says this, quote, "It will appear from everything which I have said that it is not regulation, it is not mere palliatives that can cure this enormous evil. Total abolition is the only possible cure for it. We see then that it is the existence of the slave trade that is the spring of all this infernal traffic, and that the remedy cannot be applied without abolition," unquote. So, just to sum up here what Wilberforce is arguing, because these arguments will eventually come across to America, and it basically is this. We cannot deny that human beings are dying in this. We cannot deny that human beings are being objectified, abused, and used for this. And Wilberforce basically says, you can't regulate this. We can't give someone a nice little pat on the head and say, oh, I'm sorry about your luck. He says, if it's evil, we have to call it what it is, and we have to try to destroy it. And, using words like infernal, basically that this kind of trafficking of human beings is of demonic origin, and to call it an enormous evil is to basically say, if you are involved with this trade, you have a moral issue. And, I think he makes a very excellent point. If you make your profits off of, abusing and hurting other people, whether or not they die, there's something wrong with you. And so, with all of these things being said, the slavery issue, even though when it is begun, very few people will have moral qualms with it, by the time we get to the late 1700s, early 1800s, people will start to ask the question, is it good for a Christian to hold slaves or to profit from the slave trade or to support the slave trade? And as more and more people start to say, no, it's not good, in fact, it's evil, we start to get the question of, can you treat a human being who is a Christian who also owns slaves? Well, do you treat them as a Christian? Do you treat them as a sinner? What is my ability to regard you as a fellow believer if you support such things? And we'll see this come up again and again throughout history, and specifically in the Restoration movement, this will come up with the issue of the abolition of the prohibition of alcohol, and then the questions of, smoking and other vice industries later in the 1900s. But again, once you begin asking the question, is it moral? You've opened up the can of worms to basically say, can I call you a Christian if you are involved in this immoral practice? Now, because this was a British initiative that Wilberforce and others in the British Parliament who eventually basically made any trafficking of slaves across the Atlantic illegal, because this was a British initiative, we have an interesting problem in the United States that the U.S. will not abolish slavery, and they will pretty much have to comply with the abolition of the slave trade simply because they can't compete with Great Britain as a naval power. And so this will create, a problem in America where slavery is still legal. We're not getting any new influxes of human traffic. And so where do you get this manual labor to basically, provide the backbone of the Southern agricultural economy? Well, this is going to be further compounded by Industrial Revolution discoveries. And probably the worst that we will note is the discovery of this thing called the cotton gin. Now, this was created by Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney is going to create a machine that as you turn a crank, it will feed cotton through a set of combs that will pull out individual cotton seeds. Now, it used to be that this process took, all day for one human being to do a couple pounds of cotton. Now, with this thing called a cotton gin, a human being can easily do, 20, 30, even possibly more pounds of cotton a day. And so, if you can produce more cotton, you will then have to, you want to up your production. And so, long story short, once the slave trade is diminishing and finally destroyed across the Atlantic, there will be a sudden spike or need for African slaves in the South. And so the question of politics, what states can hold slaves, which states are, pro-slavery versus which states are free, is going to become a major issue in American politics all the way from the 1830s through to the 1860s when the Civil War finally breaks out. And so what we're going to see here, you may have noticed many of the people we've looked at, some of them come from Virginia, some come from Kentucky, some are from Ohio, some are in Pennsylvania. But you notice right there on the border between slave states and free states is where this restoration movement is growing and gaining numbers. And so we're going to have people on both sides of the divide, people who are pro-slavery, people who are against slavery, and they're all going to be united in this idea of the restoration movement of restoring biblical principles and pursuing unity based on those principles. Now, I could probably muster hundreds of different examples of how this issue of slavery took on not only religious but also political connotations. Probably the best known is that of Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner was a U.S. senator who was decidedly very anti-slavery, and he would often use very colorful language to describe slavery. He would often use specifically sexual images, like that slavery is rape of people, or that a person who holds slavery, or who is a slaveholder, is basically a harlot, and that slavery is basically their mistress in many ways. And so he often liked to use very colorful language, and in one instance, he ended up basically making fun of a southern slave senator from South Carolina by the name of Butler. He basically picked on him for his speech impediment, and as this pro-slavery senator was expounding on why slavery was a good thing, basically Sumner made the comment that he can hardly keep his excrement from falling out of his mouth. Well, it's a guy with a speech impediment. He had a slight drool problem, and of course this provoked instant reaction from other senators, and a man by the name of Preston Brooks, who was also related to Butler, will take his cane and attack Charles Sumner right there on the floor of the U.S. Senate, beating him unconscious and nearly to death with his cane. Now, there's going to be two reactions to this. In the South, for example, the city of Charleston, South Carolina, is going to present Preston Brooks with a brand new cane, and on it there's going to be the inscription, "Hit him again." Basically saying, if someone disrespects this idea of slavery, well, violence is the only recourse. And likewise, in the North, people will basically lionize Charles Sumner as being, a outspoken advocate against slavery, even to the point of martyrdom. And so we're going to start to see these two growing factions, one that is going to basically say to defend this institution is to defend a way of life in the South, whereas in the North there's going to be this very strong call that, if you look at it from the point of view of a white Northerner in politics, like Charles Sumner, you basically have the argument, if this white senator is going to be beaten right on the very floor of, the U.S. Capitol, what chance does a African living in the South as a slave have to, protect themselves or to better their situation? And so very quickly, this idea of abolitionism is going to take hold, and it's going to have both political and moral connotations. And so with this, we can now move to exactly what was the Restoration Movement's reaction to slavery. Well, as we've already pointed out, that there are people on both sides of this geographic divide. There are going to be people in the movement who lived in the North on free soil states, and there's going to be people who lived in the South on slave states. And so what we're going to have is, at the beginning of the movement, we're not really asking the slave question. But as the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s keep going further and further, and the slavery question becomes louder and more pronounced, we're going to start to see three distinct positions on the question. And those positions are a pro-slavery stance, which will largely be what you will find in the South. We're going to find abolitionism, which is a statement that slavery has to end now, and often on the grounds of it being a moral issue. And then we have the third issue, which is known as emancipationism, which is a slower process that says, yes, it needs to stop, but it needs to happen in a very controlled and orderly way so that everybody wins out in the end. So let's take a quick tour here. I mean, we're not going to have a chance to look at every major figure in the Restoration movement, but I'd like to look at three people that basically personify these ideas. And so let's begin with the pro-slavery idea, and that is probably best personified in this man by the name of James Shannon. Now, this was a medical doctor who eventually ended up becoming a major professor at the University of Georgia. And Butler very, very strongly believed in the slavery cause. He basically looks at passages like we saw in Exodus, and he's going to basically conclude, look, this is a God-created institution. That if God has basically put his 2 cents in on it, that he has ordained and regulated this institution, who are we to argue with or change it? Now, I would, instantly retort back, well, if that were the case, then you can't have what we do see in the South, which is hereditary slavery, that a person who comes across in the slave trade is a slave for life, that their children are slaves for life, and it continues this way for as many generations as you have. And simply put, this is not following the biblical mandate that slavery can only last 7 years and can only be extended longer at the wishes of the slave. But this is going to be Shannon's primary argument, that if God has ordained it, it is therefore good, and therefore we in the South can practice it. Now, I do find it interesting that Shannon will eventually, by the end of his life, begin to basically concede that, maybe the pro-slavery stance isn't the best, especially when he starts to see that the question is literally destroying fellowship within the Restoration movement. And so he will eventually concede to an emancipationist view. But even at that, his primary question is the slave owner going to be justly compensated? And so that is one of the things you should probably begin with by noting for the pro-slavery stance, is that it places much more importance on the owner of the slave and the livelihood that they gain from being slave owners. Now, in contrast to people like Shannon, we have someone like Pardee Butler. And Pardee Butler is going to be not just an abolitionist, but a vocal abolitionist. That Pardee saw himself as a missionary, and he specifically chose as his mission field to go and preach the gospel in Kansas during the time when Kansas is basically having fights between pro-slavery settlers and anti-slavery settlers over whether or not Kansas will be voted into the Union as a slave state. And so Pardee specifically says, I want to go to Kansas during the midst of this fighting, during this time that often gets called Bleeding Kansas, to specifically be a missionary that is going to make this a moral issue. That to be a Christian in Pardee's eyes was specifically to be a abolitionist. And so he will go to Kansas, he will stir up all sorts of trouble. And specifically, many of the people in the missionary group that had sent him are basically going to say, Pardee, could you tone it down just a little bit? We're spreading the gospel and this anti-slavery stuff is getting in the way. And Butler will respond by saying, well, then I don't need your money. I'll take my chances and raise my own funds, but it's better for me to basically follow my conscience and do what I need to do. And, if you're going to make this a monetary issue, I just won't need your money. And so this will become kind of the kernel of this abolitionist mindset, if you will, that if there's going to be any kind of pro-slavery strings attached, we want nothing to do with it. Because, again, an abolitionist believes firmly in their heart, this is a moral issue. And because it's a moral issue, you can't just say, oh, it's okay to be a Christian and be a slaveholder. And so this will drive people like Pardee to basically say the institution of slavery needs to end now. And every state that we can get to vote to be a free soil state is a victory. Now, when it comes to the third option, most people I found don't often talk about the issue of emancipationism. And emancipationism is different from abolitionism in that emancipationism basically says we need a plan. In fact, we need a plan that lasts for maybe a generation or two to slowly kind of end slavery and create alternatives. And so there's really going to be two issues. The first is that if you take slaves out of the Southern economy, that you are going to have to basically find out how are you going to recoup your labor losses. And so the question of how do you reimburse a slaveholder? Once a slave has been freed, what do they do? Do you give them land? How? Most of the land is already owned. Do you tell them they have to move out west? Do you relocate them somewhere else? Like, for example, there was a large movement to move people that were freed slaves back to West Africa. So there's going to be that question of, all right, well, what do you do with the slave holder? And then there's the question of, well, what do you do with the freed slave? And the question of education will become paramount here. Most slaves are not given the education necessary to be able to read or write. And, if this person is not a landholder when they are freed, they don't have a marketable skill other than whatever work they did on the plantation where they served. Often you will just simply have what we eventually did get after the Civil War, which is that many of these freed slaves simply went back to working for very, very low wages as basically hired hands because, well, what else were they going to do? And so the question of how do you educate an entire demographic of slaves and get them to a point where they can be productive became the call for emancipationists. So again, it's a twofold process. One, there has to be adequate reimbursement and replacement for the lost labor. And second, there needs to be an education of the slaves themselves so that when they are released, can they hit the ground running? Now, of all the people we've looked at, Alexander Campbell is probably the biggest champion of this idea of emancipationism. And it would probably be nice to note here that both sides of the argument, the abolitionists and the pro-slavery adherents, are going to look at Campbell's stance and they're going to say, no, you're wrong. The abolitionists, because, again, it's a moral issue for them, are going to say, Campbell, how can you say, let's let this continue for another 20 years, 40 years, maybe longer? If it's a moral issue, we don't have time to let a generation come and go suffering. It needs to stop. Now, likewise, the pro-slavery adherents are going to basically say, the kind of change you're advocating is still a upturning of the entire Southern way of life. If you live in the South and you are not a slaveholder, there's still just this idea of, well, what does it mean to make it big in the South? Pre-Civil War, part of that answer is to own a lot of land and to have a lot of slaves to work that land for you. It is kind of the Southern version of the American dream. And so the pro-slavery adherents are going to say, call it emancipationism, call it abolitionism, the end result is that slavery will come to an end. And we don't want to see that. It is the basis of the economy, and we don't want to think about alternatives. And they certainly didn't want to think about giving Africans the tools necessary for them to become productive and even compete with a white landowner. And so what I find interesting is that as the Civil War is getting closer and eventually begins, that we're going to see people on both sides of the movement will attack Campbell's writings for basically saying there needs to be a plan, there needs to be a way to make this happen in an orderly format. So in this whole discussion, you may have noticed we haven't discussed anything from the New Testament. And I've been purposely leaving it here because, again, as a Restoration movement adherent myself, the question on an issue like this ultimately becomes, well, what does the New Testament have to say on this? And so, by far, the epistle in the New Testament that gets the most press when it comes to the slavery issue is a small little book called Philemon. It's only about one chapter long, and it became, during the times leading up to the Civil War and during the Civil War, one of the most quoted epistles when it came to the issue of tackling slavery, either pro or con. And I find this to be an interesting state of affairs because, it'd be one thing if the scripture was being used only by one side and that the other side was conveniently ignoring it or saying, well, yeah, but we don't buy that. But I find it interesting that both groups, pro-slavery and abolitionists, will pick up the book of Philemon and read it for their own purposes. And so this brings up a very interesting question for us who are, studying the hermeneutics of the Restoration movement, is that both of these groups are taking the Restoration movement appeal of where the Bible speaks, we will speak. And they're saying, all right, well, here's Philemon, here's what it has to say. And both will be saying this book is speaking for our side of the story. The question is not, one is using the Bible and the other isn't. The question is, who is using the Bible correctly? And who has the right to say that they've used it correctly or not? Now, because it's a short book and I, want to see you edified, I'm going to suggest that you go ahead and pause the video for a second, go turn to the book of Philemon. Again, it's only one chapter, and read it through once. It'll probably take you about 4 or 5 minutes, but give it a good read through. And as you go through there, try to read it and asking yourself, how would someone who is pro-slavery read this document? How would someone who is abolitionist read this document? And try to come to some conclusions in your own mind. Pause the video. I'll wait for a second. Welcome back. Congratulations. You have now read an entire book of the Bible in one day. See? We're making progress here. Now, let's look at this from a pro-slavery aspect. Here's the way a pro-slavery preacher or elder in a Restoration Movement church would look at this passage. Firstly, notice that Paul never condemns the practice of slavery. Paul is writing to Philemon, a slaveholder who owns a slave by the name of Onesimus. And Paul never says to Philemon, he says, look, bro, what you're doing is wrong. He never says that. He never gives a, unambiguous, this is wrong. Secondly, Paul sends the runaway slave back to his owner. Now, if I am a Southern slaveholder and things like the Underground Railroad are going on where, slaves are attempting to escape to free soil, they're going to dig this kind of rhetoric that says, see, look, even Paul would send a slave back. So what's wrong with you Northerners who are accepting slaves and then not sending them back? Now, and the third pro-slavery way to read this book is that Paul never exactly argues for Onesimus's freedom. He simply says, he's useful to me. And it could very easily be read, if you're a pro-slavery advocate, is that Paul isn't saying, you need to free Onesimus. Paul is saying, Philemon, he's your slave, you can do what you want, but it would be helpful to me for you to send him my way. And if you're really, really kind of callous about this, you could say, and Paul's basically saying, hey, Philemon, I need your slave. Make him my slave. That is a very pro-slavery way to read this book. Now, the anti-slavery reading is also pretty interesting. For example, in this book, Paul encourages Philemon specifically to accept Onesimus as more than a slave, as a brother even. And so we have the issue that, like the Old Testament, Paul is basically saying a human being has dignity, whether they're a slave or not. And he says this is even more so for those of us who are in Christ. There are other places where Paul says, like in Galatians 3, for example, he says, there's no such thing as, Jew, Gentile, slave, free, male, female. We all have the same standing with regards to salvation in God's eyes. And so basically Paul says, you guys have one thing in common, Philemon and Onesimus. You are both brothers in Christ. And therefore, Philemon, you need to treat Onesimus as more than just a slave. And a lot of anti-slavery people are going to say, now he doesn't say free him, but what else could it mean? Jesus dies so that people can be freed from sin. And Philemon, are you then going to hold another human being in bondage if you're treating him like a brother? A second aspect of that is that Paul does use the rhetoric of debt and shame to get Philemon to cooperate. He is going to specifically say, and Philemon, in case you don't do what I've asked, just remember that you owe your soul to me, that without me, you would not have heard the gospel. You'd still be, a sinner out there somewhere dying in his sins. So just remember that when you're deciding what to do with Onesimus, that I, Paul, am calling that debt into account and asking you, do me a solid favor here. Treat Onesimus like a brother. And so many people that are in the anti-slavery reading of Philemon will basically say, look, the very fact that Paul even uses debt and shame type language, it's an obvious show that there's something morally wrong here. That the only time you shame someone is when they are doing something morally wrong, and they need to basically take a good long look at themselves. And the best way to do that is to point out that they should feel shame for what they've done. And so the fact that Paul is using shame tactics basically convinces an anti-slavery person that Paul is basically saying, you've got to treat this man like a brother, and if you don't, there's something seriously wrong with you, Philemon. Whew, okay, so that was our discussion on slavery. Tune in here a little bit later where we go on to discuss issues of the Civil War and how that mostly adversely affected the Restoration movement. But I'd like to conclude here by noting three main points from this lecture. First is that with regards to the slavery issue, in the Restoration movement, all sides of the argument, whether you're emancipationist, whether you're pro-slavery, whether you're an abolitionist, all of these people are appealing to Scripture. And this is going to create a genuine controversy in the Restoration movement. We have this rhetoric where the Bible speaks, we speak. We have all three groups looking to the Bible for answers, all three groups thinking the Bible is answering their question. And lo and behold, the Bible is answering their question in ways that support what they already are. Now, again, I don't mean to say that to sound jaded. I'm sure there were certainly people who were either one back or forth to the pro-slavery or the abolitionist side of the line. But I do find it ominous that these are largely north-south divisions, and most of the pro-slavery readings of Philemon come from the south. Most of the abolitionist readings come from the north. It seems to say we can use the Bible to support what we already believe. And this, of course, is going to make a huge impact on the way that the Restoration movement will deal with other biblical issues that could be seen from multiple angles. Now, the second thing I want to point out is that because this issue of slavery was looked at as a moral issue, the question of continued fellowship will become, a pressing issue by the beginning of the Civil War. Because the moment the shots start getting fired, And while I agree, the Civil War is not necessarily a pro-slavery versus anti-slavery war. There's more to it than that. But the moment you have made a conclusion on both sides of the fence that the people you're firing at are not really Christians because they are morally corrupt, that they have done something so horrible, either if you're abolitionist, they hold slaves and they have objectified a human being, and that is morally wrong. If you're pro-slavery, you're thinking, you have blatantly disregarded Scripture, and that is a moral sin. On both sides of the issue, they're saying this is a moral problem, and I have no problem firing a gun at another human being who has this kind of moral problem. And so in many ways, to make it a moral issue is to give permission to objectify the people who have this moral problem. The end result being, we stop calling these people Christian, even though we fought long and hard to develop a Christian unity with them. And so while the Civil War will not break the Restoration movement, it will put a crack in it. And I would go so far as to argue it will put a crack that will never fully be healed and will eventually fragment 50 years down the road. And lastly, and this is more of a critique from just my point of view here, but notice that up until this point, we have not discussed Black Christians in this study. Simply put, there's just isn't a famous Restoration Movement preacher, teacher, or evangelist that comes across from an African American perspective. And I think that ultimately this is the negative influence that slavery had on the Restoration Movement. Because whether you're North or South, that Africans were objectified, that they weren't treated as human beings, that they also won't be taken seriously when they decide that God is calling them to preach. They won't be taken seriously and trained with education to be pastors or elders. And so it's not going to be anytime soon. We're really going to have to get into the 1900s before we're going to start seeing major names that are African leaders in the Restoration Movement. And I think that that is the true tragedy of the institution of slavery, is that for the developing years of the Restoration Movement, from the 1790s all the way through to the end of the 1800s, we just won't see many prominent Black Christians. And I say this to our shame, because who knows how much greater this movement could have been had we simply not objectified these men and women, treated them like the brothers and sisters in Christ that they could potentially have become. What would have happened? So I'll leave it on that note. Have a good day. God bless you, my friends, and we'll come back later.